hello from my side to all of you. I'm very happy to have all of you here. Thank you, Mari and Evelina, for the space. Thank you, Karen, very much for coming. Today we'll have a talk on the psychology of environmental protection and environmental action. Because I found the framework so useful that I wanted to give you the chance to also see it, get a glimpse, because we're all, when we're working in SPARCS, we're trying to make people save energy. So we want people in parts to change how they behave. And I don't know when I actually found this book. It's a book that Karen has participated in writing. And often we think that if we only give people enough information, for instance, as about their energy consumption, they will change how they behave. But we kind of know that there's more things in the play, that it's how important we think that this actually is, and how there's social norms, and maybe also how practical it is to behave differently. And so the framework in this book was an eye-opener to me, because in a structured way, it showed how many steps there are in between, like a general intention, I want to be environmentally friendly, and then environmental action. And when I realized that Karen is now also working at the University of Leipzig, so she's in the same department as some SPARCS partners, I was very happy and really wanted her to give a talk for us, which she's doing today. And I think she will probably present this or a similar framework today, also linked to energy communities. I have a quick question for all of you. Who of you has ever designed an intervention that was mostly based on giving people more information? Please raise your hand if you've done so. I think Cenero and Simon, with giving the screen, you should also raise your hand, because you're giving people information of their energy consumption. Okay, it looks like it's 3 people only. Interesting. We will. I will briefly present Karen, then we will have the talk. You will then have you can lower your hands again. We will then have a short moment where you can, a mumbling round, we say in German, in breakout rooms, where you can share your question and thoughts that arise directly after the call. And then you will be able to ask questions to Karen, or tell comments, or tell how this relates to what you've lived in your actions. So if you have any comments and questions, note them down. We'll need them later. But not right immediately. Okay. Any questions so far? No. Then who is Karen? Karen studied in Jena, worked at the University of Koblenz-Landau, and then in Groningen. She did her PhD again in Koblenz-Landau, and now she's in Leipzig. She's working at the social psychology department of the University of Leipzig since last year. She's working in the project Energy E2 Square, Energy Citizenship in Energy Communities for a Clean Energy Transition. And by the way, they're also having an academy that I will probably put in the general folder of Teams if anyone is. We had it last year in Kefisya that people were interested in more things about energy communities. So we might find useful information there. Yeah, right now Karen conducts research in the field of environmental psychology on individual and collective efficacy, spillover effects, environmental activism, positive emotions, social norms, and on visions of the future. And with a civil society association. She brings the gained knowledge from research into practice with lectures, workshops, interviews, and education materials. And that it is from my side. Now the floor is yours, Karen, and thank you very much again for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. I've been following SPARCS a little bit from afar, and it's really nice to see all of you now. And yeah, I hope that my presentation today will give you some insights that are new to you. I bet it will, because I've also included some of the latest research in it that's just come out this year. And yeah, thank you, Irene, for inviting me. You already said I have a talk prepared, and then afterwards we can join in discussions. And the slides I brought with me today are the ones that I usually use, for example, also when I give a lecture for an environmental NGO. So they are really easy to understand, which is good for you. But of course, there are a lot of researchers among you as well. So you also find the reference list in the appendix. And my aim today is to tell you a little bit about what actually encourages sustainable actions, and also to put a little bit of an emphasis on the energy transition, and especially energy communities, that is connected to your project and also the project that I work with these days. And to already fast forward a little bit, by the end of this lecture, I hope that you carry 3 conclusions with you. The first one is that if we actually want to change people's behaviors, we have to have quite a bit a more complex understanding of human motivation than we usually do. And psychology is one way of gaining such a more complex understanding of it. The second one that Irene already said was that we often already have enough knowledge. So it's not all about just presenting people even more knowledge on topics. The third conclusion that you will take with you today is that social influence interventions are usually underestimated. They are much more powerful than we tend to think. And the fourth one is that it sometimes makes, or not sometimes, but oftentimes makes sense to think in terms of how can we change structures and behavior first, and then motivation follows. So these are the conclusions that in the end will make much more sense for you. And yeah.
One question, Karen.
Yeah.
Your slides, should they already have changed?
No, now they should change.
Okay, perfect. I just thought maybe you had clicked and just no, then everything's fine.
But if they change now, everything's perfect. Okay. Great. So before I start into the presentation, I wanted to give you some background about me. I'm currently a researcher at the University of Leipzig. There you see our department in social psychology, and I did my PhD in the environmental psychology department of the University of Koblenz-Landau. But I'm not only a researcher in the current EC2 project, but also a science communicator. So the book that Irene talked about, I published it, I thought about it today, I think 7 years ago. So it's already been quite a while, and a lot of things happened in the meantime that I will also present to you today. But yeah, this was kind of the kickoff of my work in presenting psychological knowledge on the climate crisis to people from other fields, from other sciences, but also to people in practice. And this is organized in a collective that's called Wandelwerk e.V., an organization that I co-founded. And we still give a lot of workshops, and currently, that's maybe also interesting for you, we're also working on a book on collective climate action that's all about protest and engagement. So this is part of our mission. But the project that I'm involved in now, that takes up most of my days, is EC2. And we've already, it's already 2 years old, the project, and it will end in May 24. So we've already came up with some conclusions, and something I just brought it with me as a small pitch, because it might be interesting for you. We thought a lot about how the concept of energy citizenship could be understood. and define it now as people's rights and responsibility, rights to and responsibilities for a just and sustainable energy transition. And we've just published a scoping review on the topic that tackles a lot of how regulations around energy communities are currently showing that there's a concept of energy citizenship that's emerging. So this might be interesting for you as well. And I wanted to show you. And the psychological part in our project that I work in right now has the main question of what motivates people to join energy communities. And yeah, so this is also kind of the focus today. But the question in the background is, what is environmental psychology, the discipline that I come from? And basically said, you can imagine that it's the interaction of humans and their environment. So on the one side, you see people with all of their thoughts, their feelings, their actions. And on the other side, there's the environment that can be understood in terms of the natural environment, their interaction with nature, but also architecture. That architectural psychology is also part of environmental psychology. Also, human-machine interaction can be part of environmental psychology, but there's a large part, and that's ever increasing, of environmental psychology that looks at environmental crisis. And this is also what I've based the talk on today. Okay, now it's moving. So I first wanted to also highlight why it is important to take a look at environmental psychology. It's from our perspective, of course, there needs to be a lot of research on what new technologies could there be to improve our environment. But usually these technologies cannot just be spread, but people have to accept them. That's one thing, and adopt them. So this is something where psychologists have gathered a lot of knowledge about how we can make it more likely that people will actually accept and adopt these technologies. The second thing is that even if they do, we do have some indications that there sometimes might be rebound effects, kind of canceling out the efficiency gains that we have, and they're oftentimes rooted in human behavior. So I bet you've heard a lot of it before. If people switch to electric vehicles, it's not uncommon that they tend to drive more. So there are some trade-offs, and psychological knowledge can investigate when this rebound effect, for example, is more common or less common. And a big domain where I think psychology is really important is the actions where we actually want to reduce an unsustainable behavior. For example, where we want to reduce energy consumption and not just let people switch from one type to the other, but these kind of sufficiency behaviors. These are a special target of environmental psychology. And the examples that I talked about before, they all stick to the private sphere. And this is something that has been studied in 90% of environmental psychology, I'd say. But of course, there's also research on protesting. When do people go on the streets? When do they volunteer their time freely for environmental issues? Also, when do they choose a profession that's in sustainability? Most of you are probably these kind of people. It's a question that's not researched that much yet, but that falls in the sphere of environmental psychology, and also voting behavior, which is important for societal change. But to have a disclaimer already in the beginning, of course, just thinking about psychology and thinking about how to change people's behavior raises the possibility, people can actually change. But I want to highlight that just because it's possible doesn't mean that the responsibility should lie on the individuals. In our energy citizenship paper, we made it clear that a lot of the responsibility lies in governments and other agents. And I always want to highlight that just because you're listening to environmental psychology, it's not people that only have to change. And also there's a disclaimer that the effect sizes that we deal with in psychology are rather small. So for example, a recent meta-analysis found that treatment groups that got an environmental psychology intervention showed a 12% increase in their pro-environmental behavior compared to a control group, which is something, but it's not really a lot. And this is why psychology strongly has to work together with other sciences and really relies on and informs these sciences in order to make interventions even more fruitful. Yeah. And before we dive into the model that I brought with me today, the framework, I would like to hear some of your opinions, because a lot of our questions today deal with energy communities, and I prepared a Menti. I hope you're familiar with it. You can, maybe I can also post it in the chat. You can put in www.menti.com, put in the code, and then answer the question. You have up to five slots for answering what motivates people in general to join energy communities from your perspective. And also if you think about yourself, because psychology, I mean, I present to you scientific knowledge, but sometimes it's really good to also think about yourself and how what influences your own actions. So it's also the question of what motivates you or could motivate you to join energy communities. And I'm just closing the presentation now and opening the Menti. And I hope everything works. So this is what it should look like right now. What motivates people or you to join energy communities? And it should appear soon. Okay, there we have the first answers. But yeah, don't be guided by them. Just think about your own ideas. Okay, please put in the last words. I can read some of your answers. Okay. It's still moving. We see that a lot of the answers dealt with money. We see saving costs, for example. There's 1 point on money, lower investment costs, saving the money. But we also see a lot of other answers, which is already good, because this indicates that you already have, as a group, quite a complex understanding of motivation. We have energy autarky and self-sufficiency, for example, at 1 point, environmental issues, and some ideas about, okay, it has to kind of be placed in people's values, but also something about the community, which I think is good and will also show in the presentation, so that they want to belong to the community, do something for the community, want to have the energy local, and not only broader. Have a future, I also see. Reduce carbon emissions. This is a really environmental reasoning, or the climate crisis. I also saw trend, which is nice. That already foreshadows a little bit that social processes are involved. It's trendy. Maximizing the impact. That's something that will relate to what we call efficacy beliefs. I think, wish to contribute. We have a broad range of motivations, and I will definitely save this and put it into the presentation afterwards, so you can also make the link. And we already saw here that you have, as a group, a lot of ideas. Of course, not all of the ideas are only by one person, and today we will also see which of these factors might be more or less important. So going back to the presentation. Let's see. Irene, could you give me a heads up that you see it again?
Yes, it works.
Great. Okay, so this is also the basis of my talk today, our motivation and the assumption that we need a more complex understanding of motivation. And I present to you today a framework and a model for explaining environmental actions. It's an expansion of the integrative influence model of everyday environmental behavior by Ellen Mattis. A little bit nicer portrait than usually in journal articles. And she actually put two theories together that are really common in environmental psychology. The first one is the theory of planned behavior that has been used to explain sometimes rather high-cost behavior, for example, switching to a sustainable energy supplier, and the norm activation model, which is mostly explains kind of low-key or low-effort behaviors like switching off the light. And in this presentation, I will also go a little bit more into detail about the social identity model of collective action, which can be combined in some instances. And I will guide you through this process. So after everything, you will know all of the components. You've heard about some of the interventions with which you can target these components. And I've also brought some examples with me from practice, so it's maybe easier to grasp. So starting with the first part. The first part is the personal ecological norm, which we can understand as something like our inner compass, showing us should we go left or right. And the first part of the personal ecological norm is problem awareness. So people really have to perceive that our natural world, and maybe also that humans in this natural world, are in danger. I've brought some representative surveys with me about the energy transition and also other problem awareness. And on the right side, they asked the question, these representative surveys asked the question, do you think that the energy transition is the right way to go? And here we see that in 2019, about 60% said in Germany, it's based on a German sample, and of course, it's different in different EU countries, and we have to take this into account. But in Germany, 60% of the people said, yeah, the energy transition is the right way to go. About 30% were not sure, but could maybe be persuaded, and only 8 people said, no, it's not the right way to go. So we already have a strong, a strong problem or solution focus here in this group. On the right side, the question of problem awareness is, people were asked, I believe that the way that we treat nature on this earth is extremely problematic. And the phrasing of this is already really extreme, as it highlights extremely problematic. And what we see is that 80% says, yeah, I agree to the statement. 16% were like, maybe, maybe not. And yeah, only 5% said no, it's, or even 4% said, no, that's not true. So we see that with regard to the overall problems, we do have a lot of problem awareness already. And this is probably why most of environmental psychology research has found that pure information campaigns rarely lead to actual behavior change. So if you inform people about the problem, if it's a new problem, might be different, but problems like climate change that are already have been around for quite a while, these campaigns usually have not been very effective. And what we usually say as environmental psychologists is that problem awareness is a good basis, but at some point we don't need that much more information about the problem. We need more information, for example, about solutions. So a combination with other strategies is really necessary, that I will talk about today. And since we still at some points really want to talk about what the problem is, especially in cases where we think that people really do not know the problem yet, it is, for example, really important in our communication to mostly draw attention by involvement. And involvement, what I mean with this is target group specificity, something that is really difficult for us as environmental psychologists or environmental scientists, because we usually want to change everyone, but still it makes interventions much more effective if we choose a target group. And I brought with me an example from a campaign on sustainable soil, which is an issue that not a lot of people have in mind. And I was invited there to do psychological counseling. And here what you see on the bottom, you don't have to be able to read it. It's kind of the guidelines that I was presented with, and that they probably would have just published in a brochure like this, maybe a little nicer. But what we came out with in the end, you see it here, is a brochure where we really narrowed it down to the most important points. So a list of 20 points became a list of only 4 points that were described in much shorter paragraphs. And something really interesting about this project was also that we decided to use specific target groups. So it was not just, okay, we want to make the issue of sustainable soil more present in the general public, but there were brochures. One was for people living in the city, one was for people living on the countryside, and one was for people planning to build a house, because this is especially important for how they deal with the soil. So there you really have small and easy to grasp information. Just one example of it. So this was problem awareness. It's good to have it, but it's definitely not all. The second part of the personal ecological norm is perceived responsibility. So people not only have to see that there's a problem, they also have to feel that their own behavior is relevant to the solution of the problem. So it's not only about the economy, it's not only the government's fault. Also, I am at least a little bit for my individual behavior responsible for this issue. And here again, you see a German representative sample that was asked how they thought about the statement. Every single one of us has to take responsibility in their own surroundings so that future generations find an environment worth living in. And what we also see here, that there's barely anyone not agreeing to the statement. So we do have a lot of perceived responsibility, at least self-reported perceived responsibility. This is always the fault of or the downside of surveys, that we don't know who's only answering it because they think that they should answer it because other people expect it from them. But still, the rates are so high that we can expect that, at least in the German sample that took part in this survey, there was a lot of perceived responsibility. So this is important. Also an important step to take, but definitely not the only one. And here it's I also brought some insights from energy communities from a study by Slot et al. who found that energy community involvement was indeed predicted by the importance of the energy transition, so something more precise, but it was not predicted by the overall ecological values. Because you can imagine that coming from values to a more precise topic, it takes a lot of steps. So the stronger or the more, the closer we are to our target behavior, which is energy related, the more it will be predictive. So yeah, ecological values are also important as a basis, but also not the only thing that we should target. There need to be other motivational steps. But of course, we also sometimes want to raise this perceived responsibility, especially sometimes in target groups, if we think that, for example, we want to have an intervention in an EU country where the perceived responsibility is not really high yet. And if we make this assumption, we should definitely base it on surveys, because from people's behaviors, we can definitely not deduce how responsible they feel. So how do we do this if we want to foster perceived responsibility? There's a long-term strategy that's teaching and highlighting values. So it's the whole approach to making pro-environmental values more prominent in schools, in universities like here. Yeah, but I don't want to go into this value communication area. There are some other more sometimes quicker interventions that are not that long lasting, but still important. The one is raising self-consciousness. So there are really interesting studies where people were placed in front of a mirror, so they would see themselves and be confronted with themselves. And these people actually told after or said afterwards that they wanted that their intention to promote the environment was stronger, because they kind of were confronted with themselves. I bet this can be done with a writing task, but especially in this case, it was just seeing your own reflection and being confronted with the values that you have. Another way of using perceived responsibility or of highlighting it is self-commitment. And there was a nice study that's already a little bit older, but still it's a really nice story, or it makes a really nice story, because it's also about energy saving. And this study had 3 different groups, 2 experimental groups, 1 control group. The first group received just any target that they should save energy. That was just it. They set a target. Okay, I want to save energy by 20%. The second group also set a target, but also wrote down a private commitment. Okay, in the next 3 months, I will save this and this much energy. And the third one was told that their name was actually published in the paper. So it was kind of a public commitment. They knew, okay, I'm publicly committed to do this because other people in my community will probably ask me if I actually did it. And what this study found is that both the first and the second group were non-effective in reducing energy, but the third group with a public commitment did best. And they actually saved a lot of energy as compared to their previous, as compared to the other groups. But what is also quite interesting about the study is that after they saw the results, they told the participants, okay, this was just a study. Your name will not be published in the paper. It was just a manipulation that we used. And still, the researchers looked at how in the following months the energy consumption, how it developed. And what they saw is that the group with a public commitment sticked to their energy saving behaviors, which the authors interpret as that if we've at some point publicly committed to something, it will change our own inner commitment to it. So yeah, this is just their interpretation, but there's also other research that shows that especially public commitment, but at least any commitment is really useful for promoting perceived responsibility and behavior. Now we go to the last part of the personal ecological norm, which are efficacy beliefs. These are the beliefs that we can perform actions and reach our aims. So it's both, I believe that I can use my smart meter, that I can understand it, for example, but it's also the feeling that if I do this, I will promote environmental protection. So also aim related. And efficacy beliefs can exist on various levels. What we usually hear about is self-efficacy, so the belief that I as an individual can actually promote environmental protection. And what we find is that this is typically related to private action. But there are also other forms. The second one is group efficacy, so that we as a group, for example, as a neighborhood, think that we can promote environmental protection, which was in previous research related to both private action and also environmental activism, especially if it was a group that was activist in itself. And the third level of efficacy is something in between the two, which is now called participative efficacy. The belief that I make a significant contribution to my group's goal. So I am a really important part of my group. And what we see there is that to get people involved into collective action, into protest, into volunteering, especially this participative efficacy is important. But next to this, I also brought you some examples of, again, practice examples of interventions. On the right side, you see on the upper one is an overview of all the labels. I think they're the German labels that you can usually find. And as you see in the picture, it doesn't end there. So there's an overabundance of labels that tell me, this is organic food, this is fair trade. Which might lead people to feel that, they are not really in control of the situation. If I see a label, I first have to do some research in order to know if this is actually reliable, which is an example of how it is easy to lower efficacy beliefs. It's too much information and letting people feel that they're not in control of the situation anymore. The graphic below is the purpose economy for the common good matrix. It's actually quite a nice concept on how to let enterprises especially move from how they currently are to a more sustainable, both social and ecological sustainable version of themselves. But when the first events that I went to where they presented the economy of the goods, they didn't have a flyer, and they just put this matrix as a flyer on the tables. And I think it's no wonder that, especially in these contexts, it never really worked to get people engaged in it, because it's just too much information and you won't understand it if you're not already involved. But thinking back on your own interventions, you might come up with some of them where you maybe thought, okay, this was not easily understandable for the people that we actually wanted to target. So what should we do in order to foster efficacy beliefs? We have to have action and effectiveness knowledge. So it's not only about the problem, it's about what is effective, or which actions can I actually take, what are the solutions, and also knowledge about the effectiveness. So it's not important to tell people, okay, these are the 100 things that you can do for the environment now. It's rather, these are the 5 core things that need to be done in order to make people feel more efficacious about it and actually be able to target any of those. On the right side, also, you see the example of the Gemeinwohl-economy, the economy of the common good, and they now have a 5-minute explanatory video, finally. So it's easier to understand what they actually want. Other things, how we can foster efficacy beliefs is, for example, feedback. So this is what a lot of the installations at home right now target. So I think I'm in control of my water consumption because I actually yeah, because my smart home tells me how effective I am. The third point is really important, because in the efficacy domain, we've found that mostly the interventions that target a collective have been successful. So it's really important to keep in mind that we don't have to tell people, your own action will be most effective, and tell them something that's maybe not even true, but also show that at large, with a lot of people acting together, people can change, and we can change something. So yeah, focus the collective more. Of course, better than information is always interaction and maybe training. So competence training, especially if it's new competencies that have to be acquired, is really important. In my PhD thesis, I also evaluated a coaching program, which turned out to be effective, maybe especially because of the visioning task that it included, but probably because of a lot of other things as well. So don't leave people alone. If you have the opportunity to have counselors or coaches that tell people how to, for example, found an energy community, that's always better. Also, not only in terms of being successful, but also keeping people motivated. Another point is that it might be important to redefine our goals. So this is something that we saw in the Fridays for Future movement, that sometimes if we're too optimistic to change a lot of things in a short time period, and if it doesn't happen, then it's easy to lose our faith. So there's always the question of which goals should we actually target in order to have efficacy beliefs that are sustainable and resilient. And the last part, something that I'm doing research on right now as well, is visions and positive emotions. So a lot of fun. So especially the energy transition in a lot of instances can be involved in, or can come along with community involvement and other areas in which people actually, really want to be in, not only because of their environmental motivation, but because they want to spend time with others because it's fun. And so these are the ideas on how to foster efficacy beliefs, or the interventions that have been tried out before. But this is also part of my work these days, to find out or to generate a framework, because we're not really happy with all the solutions that we have today. What might be important for you, especially if with regard to energy communities and involvement in the energy transition, is that we already did a study in EC Square. It's unpublished yet, and I just analyzed it 2 weeks ago, so it's really fresh. We had 819 click workers and presented them with different versions of energy transition, different setups, how they could be organized. And they rated how willing they would be to support it. This is what I mean with attractiveness here, and also how efficacious they were. And what we find is that energy communities are most attractive and also most efficacious if they focus on social justice and environmental issues. And something that was really important with this finding is that especially the social justice condition was interesting, or was attractive for our participants. So it makes a lot of sense, not only from an ethical perspective, but also from a motivational perspective, to always highlight social justice issues in the energy transition. They were more attractive also when they were initiated by citizens themselves and not the government, not only the government. Sometimes if it was citizens and the government, it was also still high rates, but only the government or only an enterprise was less motivating. They were especially attractive when they were locally based, even though these were not the most efficacious ones, but also situated in an international network. So how a lot of energy communities are currently organized with a local basis, but maybe as part of SPARCS, it's actually the way to go in order to motivate people to join them. Attractive energy communities are based on a legally binding contract and situated in a country with a clear legal framework, something that feeds into our legal team in EC Square. It's actually a really, another foundation for their claim that we need a clearer framework there in a lot of European countries. What is also interesting is that they're more attractive if members are diverse and interact a lot, and especially the diversity issue, we weren't that sure about it, but this is what we found. And also if they don't require that members have to spend a lot of time and money. So they should be effortless in a way. Yeah. Now we dive into the next topic after going into the personal ecological norms. It's social identity and norms with the question, who are you? This is at the core of social identity. And I would answer this, I'm a researcher living in Leipzig, a member of EC Square, a sister, a gardener, a member of Friends of the Earth. And a lot of those, or I picked them in a way that all of those are social identities that I have. And social identity is defined as the capability to define ourselves as a group. We already saw that in the collective efficacy. There also the we, the group, is at the center. And social norms are defined as rules and standards that guide our behavior, or that a lot of people share, and they guide our behaviors without the need for laws. So if there is no law, we might still act. For example, or the best example is a path through the woods. We wouldn't walk right next to the path. We usually walk on the path because a lot of people already walked there. And in this way, social norms guide our behaviors. And we distinguish between descriptive norms, what people think is good, and descriptive norms, what people actually do. And the interplay of these two norm types is really, really important. Because, let's see, here it slides in. There is, on the left side, you see an example. Many people throw their trash on the sidewalk. Don't be one of them. And what happens when people read this is usually many people throw their trash on the sidewalk. This is what sticks with people. It's the descriptive norm. This is what many people do. And the prescriptive norm, don't be one of them, kind of goes into the background. So if we say this to people, it will most likely demotivate them to actually do what we want them to do, because we highlighted a norm that is unsustainable. And this is kind of the big message that we are currently living in a society where most people don't act sustainably, but highlighting that this is the case actually also demotivates everyone to join and to actually do something against the climate crisis. I also studied this in an experiment on stickers on mailboxes, and we looked at the rates of people putting the stickers on their mailbox. We just threw them in there, and some of them had a message saying, well, it's good for the environment, and we as a neighborhood think it's good to put the sticker on your mailbox, so we can reduce, for example, also energy consumption and paper, the paper that is used to print all advertisement that would otherwise go into the mailbox. And what we found there is that, of course, this message that we threw in some of the mailboxes, it worked. So if people read, a lot of people think it's good, it motivated them also to put the sticker on their own mailbox. But what we also found is that the more people around them already had such a sticker on their mailbox, the more they were also motivated to put, or the more likely they were to put the sticker on their mailbox. So it was not only the prescriptive norms, but also the descriptive norms of their neighbors, even though nobody would have said, well, I'm going to put the sticker on because a lot of people around me already did it. This is nothing that we would say, but it's still really important. And this is one of the main messages today, that we should not underestimate the power of social influence. Here's a study that asked people, both experts and lay people, what they think increases people's acceptance of e-mobility or reduces it. And what they found is that most of them said either environmental reasons or costs, for example, low maintenance charges, which we also saw in your overview, even though yours was much more diverse already, which is good. And then the researcher not only asked people, but also looked at the data, looked if the people answering on certain items also answered, were kind of more motivated, also had the intention to use e-mobility. And they found that these issues, the environmental issues and the cost issues, were of course important, but most important were the social norms of close ones. So what people that are important to me actually do and think. And it was also important how their neighbors acted and whether they thought that if that they as a group of neighbors could actually make a difference. So we find that a lot of other environmental psychology components are also important. In the energy transition, we find that community identity and interpersonal contact with neighbors actually also predict willingness to join energy communities. So we should not underestimate also the influence of the community in this specific issue. And sometimes also in terms of frame the energy transition as a community project, as a local community project. How can we consider social influence? We can highlight the pro-environmental norms and trends, for example, that energy communities are currently spreading. We should avoid conflict between prescriptive and descriptive norms. So we shouldn't say, it's good to join energy communities, but the numbers are still small. There are not that many. This is something that if we really want to motivate people, we should just not highlight. We shouldn't lie, of course, but we can decide what we highlight or what we don't want to highlight. The fourth point is that we can focus on these pro-environmental, sometimes activist identities and personally relevant identities. So for a lot of people, the country identity is even more important than the neighborhood identity. So in some instances, it makes sense to actually use this in our communication, but also, of course, the neighborhood. Or a totally different identity. For example, if we want to target parents or decide to target parents because this is already an identity that might be related to pro-environmental norms because they really, really care for their newborn babies. And the fourth approach is using a block leader approach. So it is important not to just target all of the neighborhood, but also maybe with some qualitative interviews, get to know who are the most important people that connect a lot of people in this neighborhood and get them on your side. This is what also other sciences would say, but we do this as well. Then another point that might be interesting for you next to social norms is costs and benefits. And we distinguish monetary costs and behavioral costs, and I will focus on monetary costs here because Irene highlighted this before. And here, especially if we want to target one specific behavior, financial incentives can be effective. So there was a recent review that found or a review on the energy transition, and it found that financial incentives with regard to reducing energy consumption actually led to 1.82% decrease in energy consumption, which is not a lot, but it is something. And they found that it was especially true during peak consumption. And the longer people received the incentive, the more effective it was. Yeah. What they also saw is they did not only have incentives, but also gave out or included studies that gave people financial information that made it more likely for them to choose the environmentally friendly or to reduce energy because of these financial informations. And what they found is that financial incentives are more effective at motivating people than financial information. But when we look at energy community involvement, the same author that published this meta-analysis actually looked at energy community involvement and asked people what would motivate them to join energy communities. And people said, well, I would do it for the environment and if the costs were low, for financial reasons. But then again, when they looked at the data and how different concepts actually related to one another, they found that the actual predictors of behavior were indeed the environmental motive, but then a community motive. It was not for financial reasons that people joined the energy communities. So here we also see the boundary conditions of, or the boundaries of financial incentives. When we then use rewards, we should consider some points. The first one is that they should be close in time. If people receive their bill 6 months afterwards, they can't really deduce it to their to their behavior. If they would receive it right away, this would be something else. Rewards should be not too big. If rewards are too big, people get suspicious and only act because they want the reward, but not for environmental reasons anymore. And the third one is be careful when removing rewards, because we see a lot of studies that find that rates go down to the baseline again when an incentive is removed. Yeah, and another important message in this domain is that, a reward and punishment can be effective if we target one behavior. If we, on the other hand, want to target whole lifestyles, which is typically our aim, in not only because we don't only have the energy transition in mind, but the mobility transition, the food transition, a lot of different transitions. If we want to change whole lifestyles, we have to take into account how different behaviors influence each other. And spillover is defined as when one behavior can spill over to another behavior. For example, I decided to go by bike to work and change my behavior there. Maybe at some point I join a critical mass, get more politicized, and there I hear about an energy community and then want to join it. So there are some paths where one behavior can actually lead to another. And the research regarding this typically finds that egoistic appeals, for example, with financial incentives, can decrease spillover. So if I, for example, say, okay, as an employer, when you go to our work by bike, you receive this offer, this and this much money, then the spillover rates are rather decreased. Then it becomes less likely that the people will do another or act environmentally friendly in another domain. If, however, we promote especially the bigger aims, this is part of a big socio-ecological transition. We do this also not only for finances, this is a nice benefit, but we do this because of our environmental values. And when you do it, it's a lot of fun. So also the intrinsic motivation, if this is at the core, then spillover becomes more likely. And we see not only that if we target behavior in one, it sticks to this one domain, but it can spill over to a lot of others. So these were already really important parts. Now we come shortly to the topic of emotions, because it's connected in some ways to what we've heard before. And here we find that a lot of positive emotions like hope and euphoria, and also pride, pride can be connected to the neighborhood, for example. These are associated with private pro-environmental behaviors. So exactly, if we want to highlight, or if we want to motivate people, for example, to reduce their energy consumption, it is good to focus also some positive emotions. And with regard to negative emotions, we find a slightly different picture. There it's not that easy, because anxiety and fear is commonly used a lot. Everything we see in the news today is wants to grab our attention, especially by raising fear the newest report by the IPCC, for example, how it's presented in the news. And since it's already all around us, we usually already have enough fear in order to be motivated. What typically lacks is efficacy, because what studies show is that if we feel a lot of fear, and if we don't feel efficacious, this is actually where we see the lowest behavior rates, so the lowest motivation for pro-environmental behavior. If, however, we align or we know that there's a certain kind of fear, that there's some awareness about the problem, and then raise people's efficacy, this is most motivating. So yeah, it's really important to see the interplay, and to also acknowledge that in our world right now, there's a lot of fear communication. So we have to kind of balance it out if we want to promote private behavior. Also, guilt might be interesting. This is kind of the negative term for perceived responsibility. And then there's also anger as another emotion, and anger typically predicts activist behaviors. So when Greta Thunberg says, I want you to be angry, for example, this is something that's really necessary to get people on the streets. But it's not so good for to make people behave environmentally friendly in the private sphere. So there's always a trade-off. The last point in the model are habits. And these are not easily changed. A lot of our behavior is habitual, and tracking what people do every day, there's, I think it was 35 to 55% of our behaviors are categorized as habits, because we do them on a daily basis. And how can we break habits? Then one way, especially if people really want to change, is a commitment through implementation intentions. And implementation intentions is goal setting only more. It's goal setting only more. It's that people are first guided to a process in which they think what behavior they actually want to change, when they want to practice the behavior, with whom, where it will be. So a lot of these W questions are typically asked in order to get people in the mindset of, okay, what does my goal actually look like? And then part of implementation intentions is that people think about the barriers that could be there. For example, I did this once with going shopping to the organic store, and I tried for a year and it didn't work. And then I tried implementation intentions and asked myself these questions, and also thought, okay, if I want to go there and a friend asked me if I want to have a coffee break with them, do I actually go to the organic store then, or do I join my friend? And how can I make sure that I will then again go to the organic store? So it's a lot of thinking the situation through before you've even been in it, and anticipating barriers. And this actually worked perfectly for me and for a lot of other people. And in studies, it shows a lot of effect sizes too. But this is only an intervention that you can use with people that are already really engaged and want to change something. For others, it might be more important to think in terms of critical life events, because there are a lot of events in our life, for example, the birth of the first child, moving to another city, retirement, where a lot of habits change. And this is actually the point where it becomes easier to build new habits as well, and sometimes also ecological habits. This is also the time when people start building unecological habits, even if they haven't been like this before. So it's really important to target especially these groups. And of course, I want to mention here that a change in structure is always the easiest way to break habits. And if this change in structures is not possible permanently, it should at least try it temporarily. Here I have a picture of a train, because last year we had the German €9 ticket, and this would be one example of such a temporary change, where previous studies have found that if, for example, a highway was closed for 2 years, for 2 months, I mean, then people switched to public transport. A lot of them just stick to it if they made good experiences. So this is another way. And The final thing to say here is that we have to keep in mind that by changing these structures, it is important that we start with the behavior and then the motivation might follow. And this is an approach that's typically not practiced. So we oftentimes think, we first have to motivate people to behave in a certain way, and then they do. But if we change the structures around them in order to guide behavior, then a lot of times the motivation can change afterwards. And this is also what we find in some qualitative studies on energy communities, where there was first resistance, and once people perceive that it actually has a lot of benefits, their attitude can change. So sometimes it's also good to throw people into the situation that we want to see them in. And before I get to the conclusion, I want to also raise a point on protest and engagement, because these are other paths in a theory of change. And what is most important to get people on the street or to make them volunteer for environmental causes is first the social identification that I talked about and the social norms that go along with it. For example, the neighborhood, but mostly with a politicized group. So large movements like the Fridays for Future movement actually give people such a social identification that maybe makes them also to go to other protests because it is politicized. Then collective and participative efficacy. They have to think that if they join these protests, they can actually make a difference. Perceived anger, as I already said, perceived injustice and anger. They have to be angry about the government, for example, about certain organizations, about enterprises. This makes them choose this strategy. And then in the background, it's also people's moral convictions, which kind of represent that they think that there's the right and wrong. And the right direction is the ecological direction. Okay, and to now in the last step, give you some newer information on this. This year, a second order meta-analysis came out about field interventions, some things that I already talked about. And here are the results. The most effective intervention strategies in this meta-analysis of meta-analysis was social comparison feedback. So everything you've heard about social norms, social identity, and sometimes also collective efficacy feeds into this. So if we really want to motivate people, we should compare them to others and show that if they are better, we have to definitely highlight that this is good. So we have to highlight it with, for example, a smiley or something like this, so they don't correct their behavior back to what everyone else does. This is also possible, that the pioneers of environmentalism, that they draw back because the norm is different. We have to support this and their behavior with this prescriptive norms, with the smiley, for example. And in other instances, especially if they are not, if they consume more energy than the average, this is an intervention if they see this information that could motivate them. Then here we also see financial incentives are indeed effective, not in the energy community domain as much, probably based on this one study, but here we see a meta-analysis that says that in other domains it might be really important to also work with financial incentives. Then we have here appeals on commitment, for example, what you've heard just with habits or perceived responsibility, feedback interventions, smart meters that raise people's self-efficacy are part of these interventions. Or and information also, especially feedback and information, you see, are not that effective. So raising problem awareness does change something, but really not a lot. And what we also see, what is missing here, is we don't see any structural change interventions that were tested or behavioral change interventions that started with the behavior and tried to then, for example, just put people into a group session working on the energy transition and see what comes out afterwards. Some studies do that, but really not a lot, so they weren't included here yet. And what we also see, what the most important target behaviors or the easiest target behaviors are, littering. A lot of studies were in the social norm section were on littering, but here we also see that recycling and conservation, for example, saving energy is easy to target, what we see is that changing people's transportation is most difficult. So making them use the car less or use more public transport. It's probably most habitual behavior. What we also see here is that collective behaviors like protests and engagement are clearly missing from this domain. So to draw everything together, the key messages that you've heard today is that we often have enough knowledge. So it's a good basis, but we don't need to confront people with a lot of information that makes them feel like they lose control or that scares them too much. This would rather demotivate them, actually. But we need to have and apply a complex understanding of human motivation, for example, with the model that I just presented. Social influence interventions are clearly underestimated, so we have to make use of them even more. And the last key message is we have to think in terms of structural change first and behavioral motivation second, and not only think that we need to motivate people first, but these two processes should go in line with each other. In the handbook that this model is based on, there's also a canvas that you can use to brainstorm interventions. And it's also open access. You can download it on the website, and it's also part of the slides. So you can click on the link, or maybe Irene will send it around afterwards. There's also an English version. It's important. And yeah, that was now a little bit longer than I thought, but I want to thank you and ask if maybe we can have really quick breakout rooms where you can just gather questions. I'm happy to answer all your questions and comments. And also I want to highlight that, of course, at the social psychology department at the University of Leipzig, we're always really open for future collaborations on the topic of the energy transition. Yeah, and thank you so much.